In Toledo, it's from ABC News. This week with David Brinkley. Now from our Washington headquarters, substituting for David Brinkley, here's Sam Donaldson.
Well, here we go into the 90s, ready or not. And whether you prefer a phrase with intellectual depth, such as the past is prologue, or something simpler, you can't see where you're going till you know where you've been at, it is worth taking stock of the decade we're leaving, the 80s. How will history treat Ronald Reagan? Is Gorbachev really so terrific? And is Wall Street's fictional hero Gordon Gekko truly the symbol of our times? We'll ask today's guests. Tom Wolfe, author, whose thoughts on this decade are widely quoted. Carl Sagan, scientist, astronomer, the intellectual's Mr. Wizard. And Daniel Borston, historian and former Librarian of Congress. Some background on the 80s from our man, Jack Smith. And our discussion here with George Will, Jeff Greenfield, and Harding Carter. All here on our Sunday program. First, some news. President Bush is on the move this Sunday, interrupting his Texas vacation to visit the troops. Mr. Bush flew to San Antonio to talk with soldiers wounded in the Panama invasion and attend a chapel service. By today, fewer than 60 of the 320 men wounded in Panama are still hospitalized in 2 facilities in San Antonio. The president will return to Washington on New Year's Day. In Panama, Catholic bishops took the unusual step this morning of publicly urging a course of action on the Vatican, urging that Manuel Noriega be turned out of his Vatican embassy sanctuary there. Details from John Martin in Panama.
Manuel Noriega was starting a new day of sanctuary this morning, still inside the Vatican mission after a week. Outside, U.S. soldiers started their day, still ready to prevent his escape. On the streets of Panama City, U.S. troops used Noriega's plight to try to coax more of his military and paramilitary units to surrender. Noriega has abandoned you, they said. A lone jogger said he felt Panama should abandon Noriega's prosecution to permit trial in the United States.
This to me is the long arm of the law, you know. It's whatever you are, you can hide, you know, sometimes, but you can't hide all the time, and it'll get you sometime, you know.
But in church this morning, Panama's Catholics were wondering when the law would get Noriega. Some stayed away in protest of Noriega's continued protection by the Vatican. The pastor urged them not to judge too harshly, reading a letter from the bishops urging the Pope to surrender Noriega for prosecution. An informed church source said such an arrangement could be very near, but he said there had been difficulties in communication between the Vatican, the United States, and Panama City. He said Rome is sending an emissary here to help resolve the crisis. John Martin, ABC News, Panama City.
The Houston Chronicle reports that same thing this morning, that the Vatican is working out a deal to turn Noriega over to Panama, which would then turn him over to the United States. A White House spokesman denies that a deal is near. Some members of the Romanian Communist Party, a party in disarray now that its former leader, dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, is dead, say today they will formally dissolve the party and hand over all its assets to the new government. In Bucharest, an Orthodox Christian Mass was televised throughout the country, the first time a Mass has been seen on Romanian television in recent history. Ceausescu had banned Romanians from observing religious rites. I'll be back with all the rest of our program in a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by Apple Computer, the power to be your best, and by GE. From satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life.
The Proctor National Bank is closed for the holiday.
The task of summing up a decade in a few minutes. I'm sure you've seen a number of variations on the theme this week. It is both easy and difficult. Easy because everybody agrees on the basic material. Difficult because how are you going to make it different from every other summation? Our Jack Smith takes on impossible tasks every week with a style and flair that consistently makes the humdrum interesting. So we assigned him the task of summing up the 80s and holding everyone's attention in the process.
Sam, if anyone personified the decade for Americans, it was this man.
I, Ronald Reagan.
The day he took office, the hostages in our Tehran embassy got released, and the biggest peacetime defense buildup in history got underway. Ronald Reagan Reagan invaded Grenada and talked back to the Russians.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Stallone refought the Vietnam War and won. Veterans built a memorial to Vietnam, and Americans came to terms with the war. Americans felt better about themselves. America was back, standing tall.
They are threatening to kill the passengers. They are threatening to kill the passengers. We must need fuel. We must get fuel.
But we seemed powerless to do anything about real enemies, like terrorists. More than 500 Americans died from terrorism in the 1980s, and 8 Americans are still held hostage in Lebanon. At home, the first woman was chosen for the Supreme Court, the first woman for a national ticket, and the first black ran for president, twice.
It's morning again in America.
But in politics, this was a Republican decade. The Reagan Revolution made liberalism a 4-letter word. The conservative agenda gained credibility, and the right wing gained visibility. It was also a decade of deregulation. The airlines, the telephone company. But with savings and loans, government regulators were asleep, and taxpayers were left holding a $150 billion tab. Computers changed our working hours in the 80s and our leisure hours.
Welcome to MTV Music Television.
Americans got MTV and home videos, but they preferred fairy tales, so the 10 top-grossing movies of the decade were fantasies like E.T. and Indiana Jones. Americans went on a health kick, exercising more, eating less, and smoking less. Americans were also drinking less and lighter too, and the police were cracking down on those who weren't and still drove. The AIDS epidemic made Americans start thinking about safe sex.
The best protection against infection right now, barring abstinence, is the use of a condom.
Family values were in. There was a baby boomlet as baby boomers began having their own children. Maternity leave and child care became middle-class issues, and women found having it all often meant doing it all. For most married women worked. They had to. The average cost of a new house in the 1980s nearly doubled to $150,000, but wages after inflation declined. So Americans maintained their standard of living by borrowing. The deficit sent the national debt to $3 trillion. America became a debtor nation. Even Bruce Springsteen's label, Columbia Records, got bought by the Japanese. This was not a compassionate decade. The number of homeless mushroomed and more people sank into poverty, including nearly a quarter of the country's children.
I don't have nobody to play with and stuff like that, and people be mad at me, I'll go home, and I feel like killing myself.
But Americans were focused on money and those who made it. On Wall Street, merger mania made overnight millionaires, and being rich and flaunting it became accepted, even in Washington. The crash of 1987 made greed lose some of its appeal, and so did Wall Street's insider trading scandal. There were other scandals, too, an endless string of them, it seemed, and some blamed Reagan administration values.
Too much loose money and too little concern in Washington about ethics in government.
And scandal reached into the Oval Office itself.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
For TV preachers, this was not a good decade. In sports, Pete Rose achieved immortality but was banned from the game for gambling, and basketball star Len Bias died from a drug overdose. Crack cocaine swept the U.S., and the inner cities became battlegrounds. It was a violent decade. President Reagan was shot. Americans witnessed disasters, the worst oil spill in U.S. history. The terrible famine in Ethiopia.
Go with throttle up. Roger, go with throttle up.
The shuttle disaster. It united the nation in grief, and some wondered if manned flight was worth the risk, especially when little unmanned Voyager 2 sailed through the solar system, flawlessly exploring the planets all decade long. Abroad, it was a bad decade for dictators. The world, according to human rights groups, is now the freest it has ever been. In Iran, the Ayatollah died.
Strike! Strike and strike!
In China, the democracy movement, which caught the world's imagination, was brutally snuffed out. But the decade that began so inauspiciously with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is closing with the disintegration of communism in the East Bloc. Abroad, this was Mikhail Gorbachevs' decade. And the Cold War, as we've known it for 40 years, is ending, and a new world is emerging. What role will America play in that new world? Are we a power in decline? It was one of the most frequently asked questions of the 1980s, for although Americans felt better, the decade leaves them wondering how much of that was reality, how much illusion. Sam?
Thank you, Jack. When we come back, we'll take a look at the scientific side of the decade with scientist and astronomer Carl Sagan, and shortly, historian Daniel Boorstin, former Librarian of Congress, and author Tom Wolfe. In a moment.
Want to see how the price of sugar stacks up around the world? This is how long it takes the average American worker to earn enough to buy 1 pound. Less than 2 minutes.
Shaped by the wind. Proven on the track. Introducing Lumina, the adult sport coupe. When it comes to new dimensions in performance, nobody's winning like.
A success story for the 90s, how one battle in the war on drugs, crime, and poverty is being won in the home.
They can excel. They don't have to get caught up into the streets.
This family's strength and determination has helped them rise above it. Watch Peter Jennings on ABC's World News Tonight this week.
Dr. Sagan, welcome. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Here to join me in the questioning are ABC's George Will and Jeff Greenfield. You know, often recently when we've started a decade, the scientific question has been, can we beat the Soviets? I take it you think that the question today is, can the human race survive?
Yeah, can we beat ourselves, so to say? Because one thing which has become really very clear in the decade of the 1980s is the ways in which our technology can challenge and pose the gravest problems for the continuance of our civilization. There are several areas. One is the depletion of the ozone layer and the increased ultraviolet flux at the surface of the Earth. Another is the increasing greenhouse warming. A third is nuclear winter. All three were discovered or their seriousness first appreciated in the 1980s.
Yes, but you and your brethren are really people crying in the wilderness, aren't you? How do you get anyone to focus? I must tell you, I think the hole in the ozone layer may kill us, as you say, but at the moment, who cares?
Well, a lot of people care because 2 years ago there was a protocol signed in Montreal in which some 30 nations promised to phase out the production of CFCs by the year 2000. So that is an indication. I agree with you, there's a lot of resistance and denial. But that is an indication that in the real world we can actually come to grips with the existence of such problems. I'm hopeful that we can do it in these other areas as well.
Well, you out there crying in the wilderness are not crying with one voice. I mean, there are people who dispute the facts of the matter about the greenhouse effect, for example, which causes a problem here in Washington where people try and bring scientific knowledge to bear on public policy. Are we going to know enough in the 90s to build a political consensus on the basis of scientific unanimity?
Well, there is no such thing as scientific unanimity, as you say, on issues of this complexity. We can't predict the weather a week into the future. How are we, with perfect unanimity and perfect accuracy, going to predict what the global climate is like in 30 or 50 years? Although climate is a lot easier to predict than weather. But the point is that the difference among scientists is not whether there is a greenhouse effect. There's no question about that. It is not whether the greenhouse effect is increasing. There's no question about that. The question is, how serious will the consequences be? Now, to respond to greenhouse warming, there are a set of things which make enormous amount of sense apart from greenhouse warming. That's why I'm optimistic that we can do something. For example, greater fuel efficiency, search for alternative sources of energy. Stop cutting down forests. Human species is cutting down an acre of forests every second. Let's plant trees instead of destroying them. That makes sense on all sorts of other grounds. So you don't have to believe the most pessimistic prognostications in order to deal with the problem.
The history of science is one of serendipity, of surprise, sort of just things happening that no one could predict. Was there a serendipitous event that will strike historians of science about the 1980s?
Well, a whole bunch of them, but I mean, I agree with you about serendipity. The thing that worries me about the three kinds of catastrophes, potential catastrophes I just talked about, ozone, greenhouse, nuclear winter, is that they were discovered by accident, that they were serious. And that raises the issue of what else have we overlooked? You know, in this country there is no serious, concerted effort to try to find out and defuse other large-scale environmental catastrophes that our technology is generating.
But Dr. Sagan, the point that George raised is one I want to follow up, and that is that we're raised to think of scientists as, in a sense, politically neutral, like Sergeant Friday, just the facts, man. And yet, scientists often carry with them political agendas. It's almost like getting a group of economists or lawyers to line up. Is nuclear winter as bad as some people say? Well, find the experts. Will Star Wars work? You say no. A group of other people say yes. And one of the things that strikes me about the debates in the 1980s is that the scientific community often seems to have no more independent validity than any other group of interest advocates. Is there any way that you can suggest to us that we can say, no, these are objective facts, not politically, not with political spin control?
Two things I would say. First of all, if you're accusing scientists of being human, we plead guilty. Certainly, we are citizens like everybody else, and if we see something that seems wrong, we have to speak out about it. Someone else has a different political perspective that may tilt it in a different way. But science has an error correction machinery built into it, and these differences don't last very long. For example, on the ozone issue, a lot of argument in the mid-70s when it was first raised. Now, very little argument on the seriousness.
But enormous argument right now on the effects of global warming.
Yes, there is, and that's healthy and normal, and will shake itself out.
And 15 years ago, we had the Club of Rome, and the limits of growth, and the exhaustion of this and that resource. And the planet seems to be somewhat more resilient than scientific community is given it credit for.
Well, I would not say that the Club of Rome analysis represented the consensus of the world scientific community. The one thing I wanted to say to both these last points is, if you're expecting that policymakers can go to the scientific community and ask for an unambiguous solution to these problems, I think you're asking too much. The policymakers have to themselves understand the nature of these issues. Policy is always made in the face of uncertainty on scientific issues as well. But if there is a grave hazard to the planet, which is alleged to emerge, it has to be given serious consideration.
Jeff mentioned a moment ago that you have been an opponent of strategic defense initiative. Now, there are gradations from simple to complex. December 1989, last month, last year of the decade, Iraq fired an extremely sophisticated missile. We're going to see, people seem to believe, the proliferation of technology and advance of civility among some pretty renegade regimes. One in Iraq, of course, used poison gas. Does that cause you to rethink whether or not we ought to have some kind of strategic defense in case a madman in the third world with one missile and one bomb shoots it?
A madman in the third world, or the second, or the first, and there are madmen in all three worlds, has a much easier option available, since nuclear weapons can now be fit into suitcases. All you have to do is put it into your embassy and blow it up on command. The idea that the madman is going to fire a strategic missile from halfway around the world to the United States is missing the reality, in my view. I think one of the remarkable things about the 1980s with regard to Star Wars is that 10,000 leading U.S. scientists and engineers said, we will not participate in this mad scheme. The idea that Star Wars...
A lot did.
Sorry, a lot did. But never before has there been such a revulsion from a presidential mandate to the scientific community, and in my view, for very good reason.
We have just about 10 seconds left, so that's my chance to give you questions that you only have time to answer yes or no. Will the decade of the 90s see such cures as a cure for cancer? Will we get control of AIDS? Will it be medical scientific advances such as that?
Prophecy is a lost art, but what the decade of the 1990s will bring is an emerging transnational and transgenerational perspective, which is certainly happening right now, and I think is to the good of the human species by a very large factor.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sagan, for being with us today. Joining us next, the former Librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin, and shortly, author Tom Wolfe, when we return.
Is it going to be scary?
There was a time. Continue in a moment.
This week celebrate the 20th anniversary of All My Children, plus Monty Python's Michael Palin, and from the Father Dowling Mysteries, Tom Bosley on Good Morning America this week.
Once a year, and only once a year, the Men's Warehouse has a sale. And this is it. Save 30 to 50% on thousands of suits, sport coats, slacks, shirts, ties, and sweaters. All wool suits selling elsewhere for $375, now just $159. It takes a Men's Warehouse sale to beat a Men's Warehouse price. I guarantee it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Glenn.
And I'm Don Nelson. New Year's Day, a look back through the 80s.
So Neil would come to the track, and he would sing to the horse, and she would win.
I just bumped into a guy that asked me if I wanted to be a model.
So here's our couple #1 looks, and there we go.
Okay, where is the strangest, most unusual place the two of you ever made whoopee?
Oh, no, wait a minute. Meet the stars that we've met and listen in on the things we've talked about. Monday on Good Morning Houston.
Carousel, Sunday night at midnight.
Dr. Boorstin, nice to see you.
Delighted to be here, Sam.
Well, now you're a historian. 100 years from now, will historians then look back on the 80s, the 1980s, and say, that was a decade that mattered, or will we just be past in history?
Well, you know, Sam, unlike some of my colleagues whom I respect very much, I think of history as the cautionary science. The science which should warn us against premature obituaries and Armageddons that haven't arrived yet, and hasty packaging of events. And I think that hasty packaging, if I may say so, is partly due to the effectiveness of programs like this, which bundles things together and makes people decide what the 10 years add up to. Or maybe God didn't think of the world in the decimal system.
That's right, but Dr. Boorstin, everyone sitting at home can sit there and say, gee, I don't know one way or the other. They look to people like you to give us some educated view. And if you duck the question, where are we?
Well, I can give you a few cautions if you
if
what I will do instead of prophecy. Well, I think the first caution is not to jump at conclusions. You know, I think back of the year 1789, and I think of what happened then when Americans were just as enthusiastic about what was happening in France as we are now about what's happening in Eastern Europe. And then, to their surprise, the guillotines came out. And the result of that was dissolution. Not only dissolution, but laws inhibiting the freedom of Americans, the Alien and Sedition laws in 1798. And I think that we should reserve our judgment on what's happening in Eastern Europe. You know, one of the things that I saw just yesterday that troubled me was the new president of the free Czechoslovakia, Havel, was elected unanimously. Now, is that a good sign? I'm not sure it is.
Let me ask you about our country, of which you're a distinguished historian. We've always had a kind of messianic impulse. We're going to bring particular religions from the old world to safety here. We were going to have a manifest destiny to conquer the continent and then to export democracy wherever we could find a willing recipient. Do you see an exhaustion of that impulse as a result of events at home and abroad in the 80s? On the one hand, people said it was a self-absorbed, selfish decade at home, and abroad, people seem to have bought Jefferson. What is there left for us to do? Now, granting your cautionary remark that Jefferson's not firmly in control in Romania just yet.
Well, Jefferson's hope, you may recall, was an empire for liberty. And I think we have to accept the variant definitions of liberty. I think we must remember that some people think of liberty as the slavery of fanaticism. The people of Iran thought they were freeing themselves from the Shah by taking on a new kind of dictator. And I think that the power and the influence of our country doesn't come from our power or our wealth, and shouldn't, but should come from the fact that this is a place of discovery. People found here that they could do things they never imagined they could do back in their own countries. And also, if we look back on history and see what are the nations that have left their mark on us most profoundly, they're nations which today are not major powers. Greece, Italy, the Netherlands. These are the sources of some of the great thoughts that govern us.
A great many, just to follow this, a great many people think one of the things that happened in the 1980s in this country was a rapid decline in the quality of public discourse, and they blame it in part on television, the dominance of the graphic over the literary modes of communication. Should we be alarmed?
Well, I would warn us against being alarmed. In general, I think we should not be alarmed. Americans are inclined to be alarmed, and one of the reasons is it's the land of instant everything. A person can come here from Romania or the Soviet Union and becomes a Democrat with a small d. That leads us to think that maybe the same thing can be happening elsewhere, but it can't. When people remain in the land of their ancestors, it's much more difficult. They're imprisoned by their history and by the landscape, which is full of the monuments of their past.
And yet, if I may, what struck me so much about this last year is we're always told that there are no more heroes. Every generation looks back and says they had heroes then, giants in the earth. Abroad, there seem to have been a whole number of heroes, whether it's Havel or Lech Wałęsa, Milan Kundera, whoever you want to cite. And yet, at the same time, when events in Eastern Europe, for example, seem to be real events, terribly important, the land in whose name they seem to be responding, that is the birthplace of freedom, seems to be a land increasingly dominated by what you once called pseudo-events, a kind of synthetic quality of public life and an absence of real public discourse. Is there any sense in which we may learn from those who've learned from us that it is indeed possible to reach great purposes as a nation?
Well, I think so, yes. Yes, I do. And I think we should be wary of these instant judgments on the future drawn from the past of other countries. I think our mission is not to make other people like us, but to give other people the freedom to be themselves. And that has not been the mission of any other empire. It was not the mission of the British Empire, which tried to Briticize the upper classes of India, nor was it really the mission of, well, the Roman Empire perhaps did to a greater extent make that effort.
But my question is whether we can learn to be more like ourselves. It seems that George's question seems to be that we've lost the resonance of what freedom is all about, even though the rest of the world seems to be discovering its glories.
Well, I don't agree with George in that. I think that we mustn't think of liberty in this country as the conforming to some historic norm. The freedom of this country consists of the opportunity to be what we had never expected we would be, which is what the nation is. And I think that that means that when we have large numbers of immigrants from Mexico or from the Far East, these provide us an opportunity to rediscover ourselves.
Dr. Borstin, tell us about Ronald Reagan. What was his influence like on the 80s, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I would make a judgment at this point. I think that the way that we will know in another decade what his influence was, and I think, you know, one of the features of American politics which hasn't been emphasized enough recently is that a peculiarity of a democratic society like ours, a socially democratic society.
But surely you have some opinion.
Well, I would say I would consider him a representative man more than a leader. That is, I think that this is what Emerson said was characteristic of our society. The representative man is the man who expresses some of the predominant attitudes of his time. He doesn't necessarily live on as a hero. And I think that President Reagan had the ability to express what was on many people's minds, but I don't think it meant that he was necessarily a great leader.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Borstin. Thank you for coming in. Joining us when we come back will be Tom Wolfe, author of, among other works, the decades-defining novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities. In a moment.
200 years ago, the only way to see Sydney Harbor was from the deck of a prison ship. Today, you can relax in the back of a water taxi as you cruise to Watson's Bay and Doyle's on the beach, where you can feast on everything from Sydney rock oysters to Tasmanian trout. But if you go, come early and bring your Visa Gold card. Because at Doyle's, they don't run their water taxi all night, and they don't take American Express. Visa Gold, it's everywhere you want to be.
I have to cancel.
I keep canceling.
I have to cancel.
Why do you keep putting it off?
Mother, I'm not.
GE's breast cancer detection system.
I keep meaning to. Did you go? I'm too busy.
It can detect tumors too tiny to be felt.
I had such a busy week. I'm going to go next week. I can't find the time.
I just haven't had time.
When?
It can help increase the survival rate to 91%.
I'll go when I have the time. Next week. Oh, I can't next week. Don't As stop. soon as I can find the time, I'll go.
But there's one thing GE can't do. We can't make you go.
It's nothing to worry about. I just couldn't go.
I find the priesthood to be a gentle profession. Working with my colleagues brings me great joy. I stay away from trouble as God is my witness. Sometimes the good guys do wear black.
The all-new Father Dowling Mysteries, premiering Thursday.
Joining us now from Southampton, New York, author Tom Wolfe. Thanks for coming in.
Oh,
or at
my
least
pleasure,
for being
Sam.
there. Now, you have written about this decade of the 80s as a decade of greed. Is that the way we're all going to be remembered, just as a bunch of money-grubbing people?
No, not just that, but what you have to remember is that we are still in the rising curve. It hasn't fallen yet, of a boom that began about 1943. It created a wealth that probably has no example in, has no precedent in history. So you can be sure that right now your electrician or your burglar alarm repairman is right now in Puerto Vallarta or Barbados or St. Kitts. He's there with his third wife. They're sitting on the terrace and having a little designer water before brunch.
Well, all right, but isn't there a difference? I mean, wealth is one thing. Maybe wealth is good, but the Gordon Gekko business from the movies, that greed is good. I mean, is it the greedy, not just the wealthy?
Well, it has created, without any doubt, a period of money fever, and that's the period we're in right now. Robert Nisbet, the sociologist, has revived an old phrase of Thomas Carlyle's, which is an age of the cash nexus, in which the ties of sheer cash, sheer money, replace the old ties of honor, duty, country, and all the rest of it. And I've been talking recently, for example, to personnel managers, so-called headhunters, and they tell me they have never seen a period in which employees have so little loyalty to firms, because the only tie now is money. And why should they? When the head of the firm, when the time comes, is perfectly willing to bail out of the organization on his golden parachute once the leveraged buyout has taken place or the hostile takeover. That's we are in this is the money fever, the excessive side of something that basically is quite good, which is prosperity.
Tom, you live in Manhattan, which isn't even New York City, and New York City, as we have to keep reminding you people up there, isn't even New York, isn't even all the state or the country. Could it be that you're generalizing from a neighborhood about a decade?
Now, I think if you'll go out to some of the new technoburbs, as they're called. These are entirely new communities far from the cities, like Naperville, Illinois, which Nicholas Lehman recently investigated. This is a community well outside of Chicago, formerly a rural area. You'll find the same cast of characters, which we call the yuppies, and the people who talk about time bankruptcy because they don't have time both to do their aerobic exercises and their two jobs. And send the children to their special instruction in languages. I mean, the same, in a way, rather marvelous ambitions that people have for themselves are to be found in all over the country. Look at the gourmet section of the grocery stores in the shopping malls in the middle of nowhere.
The last time that the United States was characterized as overrun with more than the usual quota of vulgarians was an age called the Gilded Age. Now that age following the Civil War was a period of great boom and speculation and all the rest. It also was arguably the most creative era of American history. We socialized enormous numbers of immigrants, bound the country together with commerce and steel rails and all the rest. Maybe progress just comes with this vulgar side to it. Is that possible?
Oh, absolutely. This prosperity that we have is the result of something that is fundamentally quite marvelous, which is a tremendous liberty. And one of the key images of the 1980s, and one that I think will make the 1980s be remembered long, long past this particular century, is the Miss Liberty rising up in Tiananmen Square, in which here's the largest communist country in the world suddenly looking towards the Statue of Liberty in the United States as its symbol for the future.
Tom, let me ask you, though, and I have to apologize to George. I'm from Manhattan. We know he commutes every week from Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, to do his work where the real people live. But as one Manhattanite to another, the people who founded this country also talked about something called civic virtue, public happiness, the notion that real citizenship in a free society had something to do with participating in broader causes than just individual achievement. A prosperity without that, in contrast to the 1940s and 50s and 60s when we had a Marshall Plan, a GI Bill, a civil rights revolution, is that fundamentally healthy?
Well, if you look at what's going on in colleges right now, I think you see seemingly contradictory things at work. You'll find among college students today, and I've been going around to campuses all year, that they're at the same moment in which up to 40% of the leading students in a university will be aiming for jobs on Wall Street or real estate development and other sort of high-income areas. There's also a very strong movement of concern for the homeless, for example. There's probably not a cause that is more passionately followed on American campuses than the cause of the homeless. The two things, they're not mutually exclusive, and that's what makes this such an exciting period. Again, the same underlying notion of American democracy, American liberty. It can lead to excesses in the financial area, but it can also lead to a tremendous extension of rights to people who were never given rights before. I think it's a great time to be alive myself.
Well, as opposed to the alternative, I can't disagree, but your own book, in Bonfire of the Vanities, shows how people can use ostensibly good causes for really the social climbing aspect. I mean, can we say that the 1990s is going to see more of civic virtue as an ostensible reason to have one hell of a party?
So far, not all that much has changed, and what you're talking about, Jeff, could continue right on. There's no question about it. When the first great shoe dropped on October the 19th, 1987, there was a conclusion among a lot of people that suddenly the party was over, the carnival was coming to an end. So far, the other shoe has never dropped. There's a tremendous alp of debt out there that hasn't been resolved. So far, nothing has happened to really put an end to the party. And so I can see until something else happens, the 1990s could be an ongoing...
Tom, let me a quick concluding question. That is, you write big books and you sell lots of them. Are people going to read books? You talked a moment ago about campuses. They're reading, I gather, T-shirts and cartoon books. Do people does the book have a future?
Well, one of the problems in the book industry right now is that too many books are being published. And most of those books are paperbacks, and when people buy paperback books, they are reading them. They don't put them on the coffee table. So I personally am not worried about that.
Well, thank you, Tom Wolfe. From all of us who have written books, but not with your success, we hope you're right. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Coming next, our free-for-all discussion in which we're going to take our crack at looking into the future. And joining us will be commentator Harding Carter.
He was crazy to start his own business. He won't have our resources. He won't have our computers.
Morning, Annie.
Hey, you been busy?
Sure, it's a lot of space for one guy. He says he's planning to grow.
This story's bothering you, pal?
No problem, thanks.
He won't have our graphics department. He won't have our...
He won't have our bureaucracy. I heard Greg Clancy went independent. I wish I had his guts.
I'm having lots of fun. Ain't no hide gun. I'm the boss man.
This proposal is impressive.
Who are these guys, anyway?
Greg's a creative guy. Clancy's just a bean counter.
I'm the CEO.
Macintosh has the power to make you independent. The power to be your best.
How come you got so much space? I'm an optimist.
Urban ozone. Smog. A reminder that hangs in the air over our cities. A reminder that although we've come a long way towards solving our pollution problems, we still have a long way to go. But now there's new hope on the horizon. Gasoline blended with pure grain ethanol. In study after study, grain ethanol blends have lowered carbon monoxide emissions by 25% or more, which in turn helps hold down the ozone pollution in our cities. Cleaner air is something we all want, and pure grain ethanol blends can play a part in achieving this goal. Now that's one fact that ought to be perfectly clear. ADM, supermarket to the world.
It's back-to-back bids for the national title. First in Bo Schembechler's final game, his Michigan Wolverines stake a claim for #1 as they meet USC in the Rose Bowl. Then #2 Miami makes their bid for the crown when they tackle SEC champ Alabama in the USF&G Sugar Bowl. It's all New Year's Day on ABC Sports.
All right, let's look into the decade of the 90s. And I want to warn you at the outset, I'm not going to accept any of this waffling, any of this, well, on the one hand or the other hand, who can see into the future. I want to know what's going to happen in the 90s. And let's start with something that we all love in this town, politics, partisan party politics. The 80s, the Republicans held the presidency. The Democrats held almost everything else. Is that going to be the pattern in the 90s, George?
No, I would expect the Democrats to win the presidency in the 90s, and perhaps sooner than people think. And I would expect them also to win with a black vice president.
Well, now that's 1992. Sooner than people think. That's the next chance out.
Well, no, people could think they win in 96 or 2000, yeah. But I do think that the Republicans face a dilemma. They have not run a post-Cold War election by definition. And the Republicans have had an enormous advantage from, I believe, the irresponsibility of the Democratic Party for 16 years or so.
Which black vice president?
Well, I think you're going to see, you've got a black governor of Virginia, you could have a black governor of Georgia, and Andy Young, sort of perceived as moderate, attractive people.
I see a dissent here.
Yeah, you do. My guess has been for some time that the first excluded group, black, women, even Asian, to win the White House or the vice presidency will be a Republican, on the theory that it's just much easier for the Republicans to dispense with the baggage about...
You mean Jesse Jackson has to become a Republican?
Well, I believe Mr. Will nominated Colin Powell several times for Vice President of the United States, and that's not a bad guess, or a Nancy Kassebaum type. That's where I would expect the first new group to come from for fairly obvious reasons. The broader question about the Democrats, I think, is reduced to one basic premise. We talked earlier about broad public purposes. The post-war history of America up to 10 or 15 years ago had the Democrats in power for most of the time when those broad public purposes were enacted. The Marshall Plan, the GI Bill of Rights that created the post-war middle class to some extent. The Civil Rights Revolution was the last successful one. Absent an appeal to people to join together for a broad public purpose that has any resonance, I think the Democrats always face a tremendous uphill battle at Cape Town.
Let me bring you back to the presidency and whether the party's alignment from the standpoint of who holds what in the 80s will continue into the 90s.
All right, well, first, I see no reason whatsoever why, barring one thing, the Democrats necessarily will come back in at all in the 1990s. The barring one thing is the economy. That is to say, there will be no great wars won or lost, perhaps, but barring, again, that, in which case I would say the Republicans will certainly stay in. Barring a collapse or really bad downturn in the economy, I don't see the Democrats coming in because I don't know what the organizing principle is that brings them in. What is it they're going to say? What is it? Now, I would say what they should say.
All right, say what they should
say. Which is to say, as they should have been saying throughout this entire decade, we have larger purposes afoot, and we are forgetting what they are. One of them is not to allow the permanent creation of a permanent class society. It is time for us to be reorganizing the society around some of the principles we used to say we held to. If you want to come out of the 80s into something that matters.
I couldn't agree with you more.
But the Democrats, even if they said it, would not necessarily win.
Somebody has to believe them.
Yeah, but more than that, they have to have a credible person saying it. But even more than that, at least some of the middle class has to feel economically threatened.
But the Democrats' problem is that they are perceived as the party of government with good reason and an honorable record. And I think symbolically, beginning with Proposition 13, June 78 in California, the middle class said, we are now self-sufficient. We now view the government as something taking more away from us than it's giving to us. And that's so far an unsolved problem for the Democrats.
Before we leave this, quick, who's going to be the next Democratic nominee who George thinks may be the next president?
Oh, gosh, on the one hand, on the other hand.
Come on, George.
Bill Bradley.
Oh, I'll say Bob Kerrey, senator from Nebraska.
You took mine away, Bill Bradley.
Well, what should I do? Make it Bill Bradley and make it unanimous? Should I go back to Mario Cuomo? Should I go? I mean, I got upset with Mario.
We'd like to see you agonize.
I mean, yes, I thought the Hamlet of Albany just, but no. All right, I will. Mario Cuomo, I'm still behind you in the sense of a predictor. Okay, let's move on. I thought Dr. Borstein's point that one party had emerged in Czechoslovakia was interesting. Do you think, in fact, freedom now is going to wipe away all dictatorships in the 90s? We'll get to the year 2000, democracy will be everywhere?
Here's something that Hadi and I talked about a month ago, and that is the prospect that by this decade's end, there will not be any more first world dictatorships. That is, Europe, which now has Albania, the Soviet Union, and the Afrikaners in South Africa, if I can make that extension, are the remaining first world dictatorships. If they go, and most of Latin America goes into relative freedom, you're going to see not only a north-south split on lines of wealth and color, but on freedom versus repression. The implications for that I leave to Dr. Carter to explain.
Yeah, and I, having thought for the last month, am a little more worried about it than that, and listening to Daniel Borstein this morning reminds me that at the very moment that you hail the triumph of anything is the moment you better start worrying about where the casket is being built. And in a lot of these new democracies, as we see them now, the basic underpinnings for that democracy have not really been established. And in the absence of a lot of willingness on our part and others to pour a number of resources, including technical resources in there, I would tell you that within 5 years, not the decade, a lot of these new democracies are back again into some form of authoritarian control. And that I don't predict as something I now want to be able to say, I told you so when it happens. It is one of the functions of history that you sit back and say
there's
that
going to be
possible.
an awful lot of violence and bitterness because nothing lasts in this world like animosities. I think you may see 6 nations where you used to have Yugoslavia, to take just one case. But if indeed in the 90s it is the case that democracy and development are coextensive, then the underdeveloped world, A, will remain underdeveloped indefinitely. There's no law of nature or God or economics that says nations have to develop. And then by the end of the decade, the big international issue will be immigration.
Okay.
The boat people in Hong Kong are the shadow on the 90s.
Let me ask for one prediction on this round. Mikhail Gorbachev, still relatively a young man. More and more, I think, 59 is young. Will he still be in power in the year 2000?
I think he'll be the president of the Duchy of Muscovy, and the rest of all but outer Moscow may have flown off.
Jeff?
I think by 1999 he'll be hosting Good Morning New York.
And I think that he will be gone, not gone in the violent sense, but gone because others who are in effect his clones will think that they can do it faster and better.
All right, we've talked about domestic politics and geopolitics to some extent. Now let's get to the important subject, television, where we all sup to one degree or another. What's the shape of television, which is much maligned and, from the standpoint of the 3 commercial networks, losing audience in the 90s? Hadi?
First thing is that television is part of a larger thing, which is communication, which goes to the answer to your question. That is to say, television will no longer be, in the mass sense, the dominant form of communication, because there are going to be so many ways, as we discovered during the Chinese uprising itself.
The fax machine
and all the rest. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, as the Japanese already do, we will find in this nation the internationalization of what we do in television, in which you're going to see a lot more coming from around the world. As far as the networks, which is your point, I think that you cannot believe that we've come to the end of the cable revolution in itself. We still got 50% of all households to go. That being true,
yes.
The breaking down.
Jeff, what do you think? You're a student of television.
One of the three commercial networks, I think, will either disappear or change so radically as to not be recognizable.
Which one?
CBS is the most likely now. That's only now, sir. See what happens to the ratings on Thursday nights. I'll give you a better answer in a year. Second, I do think that if the three networks survive as they are now, the three-network share will probably sometime in the 90s dip under 50%, and our new expense accounts will call for all of us to forage for food in public parks.
60% of American households now have VCRs. By the end of the decade, 80% will have, and 80% will be on cable at least, which means that the market that advertisers care about, middle class, choosing, assertive, grazing with that wand that goes click, click, click when the commercials come up. You'll be able to dial into your television set and bring up any movie. You won't have to go out to the video store anymore. The video store is going to be a small phenomenon.
We got a minute left. It's time for your headlines. What is the headline that you would like to see most in the decade of the 90s? Harding Carter.
I would like at the end of the 1990s to have it said, this was a decade that rediscovered basic American principles about the kind of society we want it to be. A society of community, not a society of self.
That's a long headline, Jeff.
That's right.
Last time I was here, I said my headline was Reds flee Warsaw, Steinbrenner sells Yankees. I'm 1 for 2. I want the other half by the end of the 90s.
George, was your headline going to be that the Orioles will eventually win the World Series?
No, but you're getting close. I'd have a headline for the front page would be China orders 1 billion copies of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, decides to get it right. And the second headline would be Tony Gwynn bats 400 for the Padres.
Right, and mine is a very greedy one. Diane Sawyer rises to the top of television ratings and drags some poor guy along with her. That's it. Thanks a lot. That time's up. I'll be back with a final note in just a moment.
These new machines are for making aircraft parts. They're a lot faster and more accurate.
They were brought in to replace old drilling machines, but we figured we could move some milling work onto them too. So we tried 2 operations in 1 machine, and it's working.
We're saving time and money, and also getting first-time quality parts.
People with the power to do a better job build a better product. McDonnell Douglas, a company of leaders. Somehow they all add up to moments that are beyond any calculation.
Tonight we will all make our New Year's resolutions, and of course within days, if not hours, we will all break them. Since that is the pattern, why not get at this thing by doing it exactly backwards? That way, when we break our resolutions, it will bring us great benefit. For instance, I resolve to spend a lot more money than I make. I resolve to eat like a pig and gain another 30 pounds. I resolve to sit right down in this chair and never jog, swim, or pick up a racket ever again. I resolve to smoke more, drink more, and snarl at my neighbors more. Now, you see how it works? You just break all those resolutions, and you're set. Finally, then, one last one in the same spirit. Please resolve never to watch The Brinkley Show again. Now, if you will just break all those resolutions, you will feel better, and we will have our faithful audience back again next year. David Brinkley will be back here next week. I'm Sam Donaldson saying good day for all of us at ABC News and Happy New Year.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life. And by ADM. supermarket to the world. A printed transcript of this or any other This Week with David Brinkley broadcast, please send $4 to This Week with David Brinkley, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. Today at the dinner hour, join Forrest Sawyer for ABC's World News Sunday. Political, national, and international news, reported as only the people of ABC News can. Plus, Ray Gandolf with all the sports. ABC News, America's choice.
This has been a presentation of ABC News, where more Americans get their news than from any other source. At ABC News, we have a singular mission: to report to you what is happening in the world, completely, accurately, in a timely and unbiased fashion. We take that mission very seriously. You can see it in our faces. ABC News, we're America's choice.
Sunday night, bring in the new year with Rodgers and Hammerstein's Music Classic.
If I loved you.
Shirley Jones is in love.
My boy Bill, I will see that he's named after me.
Gordon McRae is in luck in an unforgettable song and dance extravaganza, Carousel.
Sunday night at midnight, here on 13.
You want to buy your new
Holy Toledo, it's from ABC News. This Week with David Brinkley. Now from our Washington headquarters, substituting for David Brinkley, here's Sam Donaldson.
Well, here we go into the 90s, ready or not. And whether you prefer a phrase with intellectual depth, such as the past is prologue, or something simpler, you can't see where you're going till you know where you've been at, it is worth taking stock of the decade we're leaving, the 80s. How will history treat Ronald Reagan? Is Gorbachev really so terrific? And is Wall Street's fictional hero Gordon Gekko truly the symbol of our times? We'll ask today's guests. Tom Wolfe, author, whose thoughts on this decade are widely quoted. Carl Sagan, scientist, astronomer, the intellectual's Mr. Wizard. And Daniel Borston, historian and former Librarian of Congress. Some background on the 80s from our man, Jack Smith. And our discussion here with George Will, Jeff Greenfield, and Harding Carter. All here on our Sunday program. First, some news. President Bush is on the move this Sunday, interrupting his Texas vacation to visit the troops. Mr. Bush flew to San Antonio to talk with soldiers wounded in the Panama invasion and attend a chapel service. By today, fewer than 60 of the 320 men wounded in Panama are still hospitalized in 2 facilities in San Antonio. The president will return to Washington on New Year's Day. In Panama, Catholic bishops took the unusual step this morning of publicly urging a course of action on the Vatican, urging that Manuel Noriega be turned out of his Vatican embassy sanctuary there. Details from John Martin in Panama.
Manuel Noriega was starting a new day of sanctuary this morning, still inside the Vatican mission after a week. Outside, U.S. soldiers started their day, still ready to prevent his escape. On the streets of Panama City, U.S. troops used Noriega's plight to try to coax more of his military and paramilitary.
Endless string of them, it seemed, and some blamed Reagan administration values.
Too much loose money and too little concern in Washington about ethics in government.
And scandal reached into the Oval Office itself.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
For TV preachers, this was not a good decade. In sports, Pete Rose achieved immortality but was banned from the game for gambling, and basketball star Len Bias died from a drug overdose. Crack cocaine swept the U.S., and the inner cities became battlegrounds. It was a violent decade. President Reagan was shot. Americans witnessed disasters, the worst oil spill in U.S. history. The terrible famine in Ethiopia.
Go with throttle up. Roger, go with throttle up.
The shuttle disaster. It united the nation in grief, and some wondered if manned flight was worth the risk, especially when little unmanned Voyager 2 sailed through the solar system, flawlessly exploring the planets all decade long. Abroad, it was a bad decade for dictators. The world, according to human rights groups, is now the freest it has ever been. In Iran, the Ayatollah died.
Strike! Strike and strike!
In China, the democracy movement, which caught the world's imagination, was brutally snuffed out. But the decade that began so inauspiciously with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is closing with the disintegration of communism in the East Bloc. Abroad, this was Mikhail Gorbachev's decade. And the Cold War, as we've known it for 40 years, is ending, and a new world is emerging. What role will America play?
Welcome to MTV Music Television.
Americans got MTV and home videos, but they preferred fairy tales, so the 10 top-grossing movies of the decade were fantasies like E.T. and Indiana Jones. Americans went on a health kick, exercising more, eating less, and smoking less. Americans were also drinking less and lighter too, and the police were cracking down on those who weren't and still drove. The AIDS epidemic made Americans start thinking about safe sex.
The best protection against infection right now, barring abstinence, is the use of a condom.
Family values were in. There was a baby boomlet as baby boomers began having their own children. Maternity leave and child care became middle-class issues, and women found having it all often meant doing it all. For most married women worked. They had to. The average cost of a new house in the 1980s nearly doubled to $150,000, but wages after inflation declined. So Americans maintained their standard of living by borrowing. The deficit sent the national debt to $3 trillion. America became a debtor nation. Even Bruce Springsteen's label, Columbia Records, got bought by the Japanese. This was not a compassionate decade. The number of homeless mushroomed and more people sank into poverty, including nearly a quarter of the country's children.
I don't have nobody to play with and stuff like that, and people be mad at me, I'll go home, and I feel like killing myself.
But Americans were focused on money and those who made it. On Wall Street, merger mania made overnight millionaires, and being rich and flaunting it became accepted, even in Washington. The crash of 1987 made greed lose some of its appeal, and so did Wall Street's insider trading scandal. There were other scandals, too.
Both easy and difficult. Easy because everybody agrees on the basic material. Difficult because how are you going to make it different from every other summation? Our Jack Smith takes on impossible tasks every week with a style and flair that consistently makes the humdrum interesting. So we assigned him the task of summing up the 80s and holding everyone's attention in the process.
Sam, if anyone personified the decade for Americans, it was this man.
I, Ronald Reagan.
The day he took office, the hostages in our Tehran embassy got released, and the biggest peacetime defense buildup in history got underway. Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada and talked back to the Russians.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Stallone refought the Vietnam War and won. Veterans built a memorial to Vietnam, and Americans came to terms with the war. Americans felt better about themselves. America was back, standing tall.
Threatening to kill the passengers. Threatening to kill the passengers. We must need fuel. We must get fuel.
But we seemed powerless to do anything about real enemies, like terrorists. More than 500 Americans died from terrorism in the 1980s, and 8 Americans are still held hostage in Lebanon. At home, the first woman was chosen for the Supreme Court, the first woman for a national ticket, and the first black ran for president, twice.
It's morning again in America.
But in politics, this was a Republican decade. The Reagan Revolution made liberalism a 4-letter word. The conservative agenda gained credibility, and the right wing gained visibility. It was also a decade of deregulation. The airlines, the telephone company. But with savings and loans, government regulators were asleep, and taxpayers were left holding a $150 billion tab. Computers changed our working hours in the 80s and our leisure hours.
Units to surrender. Noriega has abandoned you, they said. A lone jogger said he felt Panama should abandon Noriega's prosecution to permit trial in the United States.
This to me is the long arm of the law, you know. It's wherever you are, you can hide, you know, sometimes, but you can't hide all the time, and it'll get you sometime, you know.
But in church this morning, Panama's Catholics were wondering when the law would get Noriega. Some stayed away in protest of Noriega's continued protection by the Vatican. The pastor urged them not to judge too harshly, reading a letter from the bishops urging the Pope to surrender Noriega for prosecution. An informed church source said such an arrangement could be very near, but he said there had been difficulties in communication between the Vatican, the United States, and Panama City. He said Rome is sending an emissary here to help resolve the crisis. John Martin, ABC News, Panama City.
The Houston Chronicle reports that same thing this morning, that the Vatican is working out a deal to turn Noriega over to Panama, which would then turn him over to the United States. A White House spokesman denies that a deal is near. Some members of the Romanian Communist Party, a party in disarray now that its former leader, dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, is dead, say today they will formally dissolve the party and hand over all its assets to the new government. In Bucharest, an Orthodox Christian Mass was televised throughout the country, the first time a Mass has been seen on Romanian television in recent history. Ceausescu had banned Romanians from observing religious rites. I'll be back with all the rest of our program in a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by Apple Computer, the power to be your best, and by GE. From satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life.
The Proctor National Bank is closed for the holiday.
The task of summing up a decade in a few minutes. I'm sure you've seen a number of variations on the theme this week. It is